The things that ran from Morrow Ridge. Location: Pike County, Kentucky. Approximate year: 2007. That night, I never saw what was moving through the woods. I only saw the things running away from it. There were more than 20 of them. They had heads, shoulders, arms, and legs. From a distance, they could almost have been mistaken for people. But they were blacker than the field around them, and they moved so quickly that it looked as though something invisible was pulling them across the ground. This happened in August of 2007, when I was 24 years old. I had taken 2 weeks off from my job in Lexington and driven east to visit relatives in Pike County, Kentucky. My mother's family came from a small community outside Elkhorn City. It was not a town in the usual sense. There was a church, an abandoned gas station, several houses along the county road, and a collection of mobile homes scattered through the surrounding hollows. It was one of those places where everyone knew everyone else, and news traveled faster than people could drive to the next house. My aunt and uncle lived in a white house beside a narrow creek. Behind the house were several vegetable gardens, a rusting equipment shed, and a footbridge made from old railroad ties. On the opposite side of the creek, the land rose steeply toward Morrow Ridge. The lower slopes had once been cleared for pasture. Farther up were rows of planted pines, followed by an isolated section of older forest covering the backside of the ridge. That forest was roughly 2 miles wide and nearly as long, covering a little over 3 square miles. For eastern Kentucky, it was not considered a large wilderness. Roads, farms, abandoned mine land, and small communities surrounded it on every side. But it was large enough to get lost in after dark. The slopes were cut by narrow ravines. Old logging roads disappeared beneath blackberry thickets. Subsidence hollows and collapsed ground marked places where abandoned coal workings ran beneath the mountain. According to my uncle, the forest had once covered nearly the entire ridge. Logging companies cleared much of the lower land before World War II. Coal companies later cut roads into the far side of the mountain, opened underground mines, and removed part of the ridge through surface mining. By 2007, the mining had been abandoned for decades. Most of the known entrances had collapsed or been sealed with concrete and steel grates. An old high wall still stood beyond the eastern side of the ridge, and several drainage openings remained hidden in the ravines. No one seemed to know exactly how many tunnels were still beneath the mountain. Some of the maps had been lost. Others were incomplete. My vacation was uneventful for the first several days. I helped my uncle replace part of a fence, cleared weeds from my aunt's garden, and drove my grandmother to the grocery store. In the evenings, there was very little to do. The community center still held dances on Friday nights, but most of the people I had known as a teenager had moved away for work or school. So I usually sat outside with my cousin Evan. Evan was 23, only a year younger than me. We drank soda or beer, listened to music from someone's truck, and talked until the heat finally left the road. One Saturday night, 4 other people joined us. There were twin sisters named Marcy and Erin Webb, both 21. They were small, energetic, and almost impossible to tell apart unless they were standing side by side. Marcy wore her hair slightly shorter. Erin had a small scar beside her left eyebrow. 2 brothers from farther down the creek came as well. Noah Morrison was 20. His younger brother, Caleb, was 19. Both were broad-shouldered, quiet, and stronger than they looked. They had played defensive line for their high school football team before graduating. That made 6 of us altogether. The evening was warm and clear. The sky above the ridge was filled with stars, and insects clicked in the weeds along the creek. Shortly after 10, Noah suggested walking up to Morrow Ridge. There was an old fire ring beyond the planted pines, near the edge of the older forest, where local young people sometimes gathered. In his backpack, Noah had aluminum foil, salt, hot sauce, a bag of marshmallows, and 6 cans of soda. "We can dig potatoes from your aunt's garden," he said. "Wrap them in foil and throw them in the coals." My aunt would have been angry if she knew we were taking potatoes from her garden, but she had planted far more than she could possibly use, and at 24, I was still capable of making decisions better suited to a 16-year-old. We took 6 potatoes, a box of matches, and 1 flashlight. I also brought a folding knife and an old green jacket. Marcy noticed the jacket. "It's 80 degrees. It won't be on the ridge," she smiled. "You planning to stay until winter?" I had known Marcy since we were children. That summer, however, I had begun looking at her differently. She had apparently noticed. Before leaving, I told my aunt we would be back before midnight. She told us to keep our phones on. The footbridge behind the house crossed the creek into a strip of vegetable plots belonging to several families. We moved quietly between rows of corn and tomatoes, then followed a tractor path toward the hill. The path climbed through tall grass and blackberry bushes. I had spent many summers in that community and knew the lower trails better than anyone else in the group except Evan. It took us nearly 40 minutes to reach the planted pines at the top of the first rise. A steady breeze crossed the ridge. During the day, that wind made the hill one of the best places to escape the heat. At night, it felt cooler than expected. Caleb rubbed his arms. "We should go down to the old fire ring." The fire ring stood beyond the planted pines, near the edge of the older woods. I did not like the suggestion. The open ridge was dark, but the sky provided enough light to see. The forest below looked completely black. I remembered hearing coyotes there when I was younger. Black bears had also begun returning to eastern Kentucky, although no one in the community had reported one near Morrow Ridge that year. I suggested staying near the pines. Evan shook his head. "The wind will carry sparks everywhere." "He's right," Noah said. "It'll be calmer below the ridge." The others began walking. I remained behind for several seconds. Then Marcy looked back at me. "You coming?" I followed. I did not want Evan to be the only person responsible for getting everyone back if something went wrong, and Marcy was already looking at me as though she expected me to back out. We passed through the pines and descended along an old logging path. After approximately 15 minutes, the planted trees ended. The older forest began several hundred yards ahead. Between us and the tree line was a field covered with tall weeds and grass. The old fire ring stood just inside the woods. As soon as we reached the edge of the field, I felt that something was wrong. The air had become cold. Not cool. Cold. The temperature change was immediate enough that I stopped walking. Behind us, the wind still moved through the pine branches. In front of us, the weeds stood completely still. Marcy rubbed her bare arms and drew them tightly against her body. "Why is it so cold down here?" No one answered. The darkness also seemed different. The moon was visible above the ridge, but almost none of its light reached the field. I told myself the older trees were blocking it. That explanation would have made more sense if we had already entered the forest. We had not. We were still standing in the open. Noah switched on the flashlight. The beam reached the first line of trees and stopped against a wall of leaves and trunks. Nothing moved. No animal made a sound. The insects that had been loud near the creek were completely silent. All 6 of us remained near the path. No one wanted to be the first to enter the woods. Evan looked at me. "You still think we should stay near the pines?" "I think something's wrong down here." Caleb glanced back toward the ridge. "Maybe we should go." Erin immediately smiled. It was not a relaxed smile. She had noticed the way we were all looking at one another. "All right," she said. "New rule." "What rule?" Noah asked. "The first person who suggests leaving before the potatoes are done buys breakfast for everyone at Miller's tomorrow." Caleb stared at her. "All 6 of us?" "All 6. That could cost $50. "Then don't be the first one to get scared." Marcy looked at me and held out her hand. Deal? I understood what she was doing. We were all uncomfortable, and the twins were giving us a reason to pretend we were not. It was childish. It was also effective. I shook her hand. Deal. Evan agreed next. Then Noah. Caleb muttered something under his breath, but agreed as well. We carried the potatoes toward the old fire ring. The ring consisted of blackened stones, surrounding an area of bare soil. Several short sections of rotting log had been dragged nearby for seats. We gathered dry branches from the edge of the woods. No one went farther than a few yards between the trees. Everyone moved quietly. Every few seconds, someone would straighten and look into the forest. At one point, I turned and nearly walked into Caleb. He was crouching directly behind me, collecting sticks. I had not heard him approach. Don't do that, he looked up. Do what? Stand behind me without saying anything. I've been here the whole time. He stood and brushed dirt from his jeans. Then he looked toward the trees. This place is getting to you too, isn't it? I'm fine. No, you're not. Neither are you. Caleb said nothing for several seconds. Then he nodded. No, I'm not. We carried the branches back to the fire ring. The matches were slightly damp, but Evan eventually started a small flame using paper from Noah's backpack. We wrapped the potatoes in foil and placed them beneath the burning wood. The fire gave us something ordinary to focus on. At first, everyone remained silent. Then Caleb joked that the potatoes would not be ready until sunrise. Erin pulled the marshmallows from Noah's backpack. At least these might be done before morning. She pushed one onto the end of a thin branch and held it over the flames. Evan began telling a story about a motorcycle he wanted to buy. The conversation slowly returned, but no one relaxed completely. Marcy and Erin sat together on a low stump. Noah and Caleb took one of the rotting logs. Evan sat on another. I sat beside Marcy. Her shoulder touched mine. She did not move away. Perhaps 10 minutes passed. Then something cracked, deep inside the forest. Every conversation stopped. The sound was not close. It came from somewhere beyond the first slope, possibly near the center of the woods. It resembled a large branch breaking beneath heavy weight. We listened. Another crack followed. Then another. Something was moving through the trees. Caleb stood. Deer? No, Noah said. How do you know? A deer doesn't break wood like that. Could be several. Noah continued staring into the darkness. Could be. The cracking stopped. For perhaps a minute, no one spoke. Then Evan resumed his motorcycle story. He had only said a few words when a deep impact sounded from the forest. The ground beneath us seemed to vibrate. It was not an explosion. It sounded like something enormous striking the earth with a single foot. The fire trembled. A small section of burning wood collapsed inward. Marcy grabbed my arm. What was that? I stood. I don't know. The cracking began again. This time, it did not remain in one place. It moved from left to right, then farther away, then directly ahead of us. The pattern made no sense. Whatever was producing the noise seemed to be crossing distances too quickly. I took the flashlight from Noah and pointed it toward the woods. The beam illuminated tree trunks, low branches, and leaves. Nothing else. Then another impact shook the ground. Closer. The cracking immediately accelerated. It sounded as though something was forcing its way through the forest without avoiding trees or fallen timber. Branches snapped. Dead trunks broke. Brush tore apart. The noise moved in a broad circle around us. For several seconds, it came from our right, then from the left, then from somewhere deeper in the woods. My heart was beating hard enough to hurt. Sweat formed across my forehead despite the cold. Evan backed away from the fire. We need to leave. Erin pointed at him. You're buying breakfast. I'll buy the whole diner if we get out of here. No one laughed. I kicked apart the burning branches and began covering them with soil. Evan helped. The fire had not grown large, but the coals refused to die quickly. Noah grabbed one of the sodas, opened it, and poured it over the embers. Steam rose into the air. Another heavy impact came from inside the woods. This one sounded so close that Aaron cried out. Immediately afterward, something screamed. The noise was high, uneven, and almost human. But there was no breath behind it. It sounded like metal twisting under pressure. A second scream answered from farther away. Then a third. Caleb dropped the backpack. "What the hell is that?" The cracking spread across the forest. There was no longer one moving thing. There were many. Dozens, perhaps. They crashed through the brush in different directions, producing the sound of a stampede. Noah grabbed Aaron by the wrist. "Run!" They started toward the logging path. Marcy seized my hand and tried to follow them. I pulled her back. "No." "What?" "Not the path." The noise was moving toward the trail from inside the woods. If we ran downhill, we would place ourselves directly in front of it. I pointed toward the planted pines on the ridge. "Into the trees. Hide." Evan understood immediately. He shouted for Caleb to follow us. We ran across the field toward the pines. The grass reached almost to our knees and caught around our shoes. Behind us, the forest continued to break apart. It sounded like a herd of elk or wild hogs charging through the trees. Elk had been reintroduced into eastern Kentucky years earlier, so a few animals on the ridge would not have been impossible. But this sounded like dozens of them, and no herd that size could have crossed the forest without leaving tracks, droppings, or broken vegetation behind. A large group of feral hogs would also have damaged gardens and become the subject of every conversation in the county. And no ordinary animals could move so quickly through dense Appalachian forest without slowing down. We reached the planted pines approximately 50 yards from the edge of the older woods. The lower branches formed a thick wall. I pushed through them, pulling Marcy behind me. Evan and Caleb entered several yards to our left. Noah and Aaron had already disappeared somewhere farther down the row. We crawled beneath the branches and lay flat on the ground. Pine needles pressed against my face. Marcy was beside me, breathing rapidly. I placed one arm around her shoulders and pulled her closer. "Stay still." "What about the others?" "They're nearby." "You don't know that." "No." I did not. The noise reached the edge of the forest. Something struck the ground hard enough for us to feel it beneath our chests. Then came the screams. Not one. Many. They overlapped in sharp, panicked bursts. Whatever was making those sounds was terrified. That was when the first figure emerged from the woods. It ran into the field approximately 100 yards from where we were hiding. At first, I mistook it for a man. It was around 6 feet tall, perhaps slightly taller. It had a head, narrow shoulders, arms, and long legs. Its proportions were human. Its body was not. The figure was completely black. Not dark because of the night. Black in a way that seemed to absorb the little light around it. A second figure emerged behind it. Then a third. Within seconds, more than 20 of them were crossing the field. They looked disturbingly human. Some ran with their arms pumping at their sides. Others held their hands close to their chests or repeatedly looked over their shoulders. One appeared to be supporting another by the arm. Several seemed to be wearing long, dark garments that moved around their legs. But their movements were wrong. Their knees rose too high. Their upper bodies barely moved. Some appeared to stumble without losing speed. Others crossed several yards in abrupt bursts, as though parts of their movement were missing. The tall grass bent beneath them. I heard the dry whisper of weeds being crushed. They were not shadows. They had weight. They touched the ground. One of the figures turned its head toward the ridge. Its face had the shape of a human face. There was a forehead, a nose, and the outline of a jaw. But no features reflected the moonlight. The entire face remained black. Marcy began whispering beside me. At first I could not understand her. Then I realized she was praying. I did not stop her. But I had never believed that the right words could alter what was happening around us. If we had any chance of surviving, it would come from keeping our heads clear. I forced myself to slow my breathing. I watched the direction of the figures. I studied the edge of the forest. I tried to decide where we would run if whatever was chasing them emerged into the field. The fear did not disappear. But it became something I could observe, rather than something that controlled every part of me. The figures continued racing across the field. They did not scatter. They followed almost the same route, moving away from the old woods toward a low gap between two hills. Beyond that gap lay an abandoned strip mine bench and part of the old high wall. Several sealed mine openings were located somewhere on the far side. The figures passed within 100 yards of us. There may have been 20. There may have been 30. I could not count them. Some were close to human height. Others were slightly shorter or ran with their backs bent. They had recognizable hands, recognizable heads, recognizable limbs. That made them worse. They did not look like animals trying to imitate people. They looked like people from whom something essential had been removed. The screaming continued until the last figure crossed the field. Then it stopped. The forest behind them became silent. Not gradually. Instantly. We remained beneath the pines. No one spoke. No one moved. I kept watching the edge of the older woods, expecting whatever had chased the figures to appear. Nothing emerged. Minutes passed. The cold vanished, and within seconds the warm August air felt heavy against my skin. The insects began calling again. Somewhere near the creek, a dog barked. The world returned to normal. That frightened me almost as much as what we had seen. We remained hidden for nearly 2 hours. Fear distorted my sense of time so completely that I would have sworn it had been less than half that. Eventually, Evan whispered my name from the next row. I answered. Caleb was with him. We crawled from beneath the pines. Noah and Aaron were missing. For several minutes, we searched the planted rows without raising our voices. None of us wanted to shout. Finally, we found them on the opposite side of the ridge. They had entered the pines farther downhill and emerged near an old fence line. Noah had been afraid to call out because he thought the figures might still be nearby. All 6 of us were alive. No one was seriously injured. Caleb had cut one hand on a branch. Erin had twisted her ankle slightly while running, but she could still walk. We started home together. The fire was still faintly smoking when we passed the old ring, but no one stopped to recover the backpack, the marshmallows, or the potatoes. We did not enter the older woods. We crossed the field as far from the tree line as possible. The entire way back, I expected to hear something behind us. Nothing followed. Our phones began receiving signals near the top of the ridge. The time on my screen was 2:17 in the morning. My phone showed 7 missed calls. Evan's had 9. When we reached my aunt's house, it was almost 3 in the morning. The kitchen light was on. My uncle's pickup stood in front of the house with the driver's door open. He had loaded 2 flashlights, a first aid kit, a length of rope, and his hunting rifle into the cab. He was preparing to drive toward the base of the ridge. We had promised to return before midnight, but none of us had answered our phones. Earlier that night, sometime after midnight, my aunt and uncle had heard a prolonged series of cracks from the direction of Morrow Ridge, as though trees were falling one after another along the slope. Then there had been one deep impact. It was strong enough to rattle a loose pane in the kitchen window. My aunt had initially thought that something had exploded beyond the ridge. My uncle had considered calling the sheriff, but he decided to check the trailhead first. He was not relieved when he saw us. He was angry. Then he noticed our faces, the mud on our clothing, and the blood on Caleb's hand. The anger disappeared. He made us sit on the porch while my aunt checked Aaron's ankle and cleaned Caleb's cut. My grandmother was waiting inside at the kitchen table. Noah initially said that we had seen animals. My uncle looked at him. What kind of animals? Noah did not answer. We told them the story in pieces. The cold, the impacts, the breaking trees, the screams, the human-shaped figures crossing the field. At first, my aunt assumed we had panicked after seeing a group of deer or trespassers. My uncle did not dismiss the story as quickly. He had heard the sounds from the house. My grandmother said nothing until we finished. She had been born in that community in 1931. Her father had cut timber around Morrow Ridge before the largest mining operations arrived. She asked exactly where we had built the fire. I described the field and the old stone ring. She looked toward the dark window above the sink. You went past the planted trees? Yes. At night? Yes. She shook her head. Then she said something I remember clearly. That part of the ridge doesn't like company after dark. My aunt sighed. Mom, I didn't say it was haunted. What are you saying? My grandmother ignored her and looked at me. Did the black things run toward you or away from you? Away. And nothing came out behind them? No. She nodded once. That's good. I asked what she meant. My grandmother remained silent for so long that I thought she would refuse to answer. Finally, she said that older people in the community had told stories about Morrow Ridge. They did not agree about what lived there. Some called it a spirit. Others said it was simply the mountain behaving the way mountains sometimes did. Her father had called it the keeper of the timber. He believed it remained quiet unless people damaged the woods, became lost, or brought something harmful inside. According to him, there were nights when the keeper drove unwanted things from the forest. My aunt interrupted. That's enough. But I asked what kind of things. My grandmother looked toward the door behind us. Things that hide where people don't look. Then she glanced in the direction of the ridge. The mining companies thought they made every passage under that mountain. My father said some of those openings were already there when the first men went underground. My uncle frowned. There aren't natural caves under Morrow. Not ones anyone put on a map, she replied. That was the only explanation she gave. None of us slept well that night. Marcy and Aaron stayed at my aunt's house rather than walking home. Noah and Caleb called their father, who arrived with a shotgun in the rack of his truck. He believed we might have encountered people using the woods for an illegal marijuana grow or a hidden methamphetamine lab. That explanation became less convincing when my uncle told him about the sounds they had heard from the house. The next morning, several of us returned to Morrow Ridge in daylight. My uncle and Caleb's father came with us. The field looked ordinary. The fire was completely out. The foil-wrapped potatoes remained beneath the ashes. No animal tracks surrounded the site. But a wide path crossed the tall grass approximately where the dark figures had run. The weeds had been pressed flat in a band, almost 12 feet across. The path began at the edge of the older woods. It crossed the field and continued toward the low gap between the hills. We followed it for nearly half a mile. Beyond the gap, it reached an abandoned mine road. The road ran along the base of the old high wall, where surface mining had cut a steep wall into the mountain decades earlier. The flattened trail ended on hard gravel. There were no footprints, no hoof marks, no clear indication of where the figures had gone. Approximately 200 yards farther along the mine road stood a steel grate covering an old drainage opening. The grate was rusted, but intact. Another entrance had collapsed years earlier beneath a slide of rock and soil. Caleb's father studied the high wall. He suggested that the figures might have been heading for the abandoned workings beneath it. Old mine tunnels ran beneath much of the ridge, some connected to drainage passages, ventilation shafts, and collapsed openings that did not appear on modern maps. It was possible, he said, that someone, or several people, had been using the tunnels as a hiding place and were trying to reach another entrance. But that explanation created more questions than it answered. It did not explain who the figures were. It did not explain why there were so many of them. And it did not explain what had driven them out of the forest and sent them toward the mine road at the same time. We returned to the fire ring. Several branches had been broken along the edge of the woods. One young tree, perhaps 6 inches thick, had snapped approximately 4 feet above the ground. Farther inside, we found 3 deep depressions in the soil. Each was almost circular. They did not resemble footprints. They looked as though something heavy had struck the ground repeatedly. My uncle wanted to continue farther into the trees. Caleb's father refused. He said that if the ground had collapsed above an old mine, the soil might not support our weight. That was a practical reason to turn back. None of us argued. Marcy and I dated briefly after that summer. Years later, she told me something she had not mentioned on the night of the incident. While we were hiding beneath the pines, she had looked toward the older forest after the final dark figure crossed the field. For perhaps 2 seconds, she saw something standing among the trees. It was much taller than the figures that had fled. She could not describe its shape because it seemed to blend with the trunks. But she saw one arm resting against a tree. The hand was large enough to wrap halfway around it. She said the thing did not look toward the fleeing figures. It looked directly at us. Then the warm air returned, and it was gone. I have visited Morrow Ridge several times since that night. I have walked through the same forest during the day. There is nothing obviously unusual about it. The wooded section covers a little over 3 square miles. That is large enough to become disoriented in, especially among the ravines and abandoned roads. But it is not an endless wilderness. Homes and county roads surround it. Depending on the wind, you can hear trucks, chainsaws, dogs, and church bells from inside the trees. For years, I tried to convince myself that the figures had been using the abandoned mines as a hiding place. There really are miles of old workings beneath the ridge. No one knows where every branch leads. Sections have collapsed. Maps have disappeared. Some openings may never have been recorded. Perhaps a group of people had been living underground. Perhaps the darkness, distance, and fear changed the way we saw them. But even if the figures had been hiding beneath the mountain, one question remains. What caused more than 20 of them to leave the woods at the same moment and race across an open field toward the abandoned tunnels? I still walk the ridge during the day. I have never entered the old forest after dark again. And whenever I remember those figures running from Morrow Ridge, I do not think about what they were. I think about the thing they were running from. That was the first story from the 5th collection. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds. To be continued.
The black idol that crawled across our road. Location: northern Idaho. Approximate year: 2009. The first time I saw it, I thought someone had dropped a burned tree across the road. Then, the tree lifted one arm and looked through the windshield. This happened in the summer of 2009, when I was 32 and working for a small contractor that maintained access roads for logging companies, utility crews, and the Forest Service. Most of the work was ordinary. We replaced culverts, hauled gravel, cleared fallen trees, and pulled stranded vehicles out of mud. The only unusual part of the job was how far from help we sometimes had to work. That August, a lightning storm knocked out a radio relay station above a remote drainage in northern Idaho. The station carried traffic for wildfire crews, sheriff's deputies, and county emergency services. A replacement generator had to be delivered before another line of dry thunderstorms reached the mountains. The main access road was closed where a bridge had washed out, so the dispatcher gave us an alternate route over an old logging grade that had not been maintained in years. The road was called Alder Fork on the maps, although almost no alders grew along it. It climbed through cedar and pine, crossed 2 abandoned timber claims, and descended toward the relay station from the north. The dispatcher said the distance was only 37 miles. He did not mention that 37 miles on Alder Fork could take 6 hours. I was driving an old military surplus 6-wheel truck with a flatbed and a hydraulic crane. The replacement generator was chained behind the cab beneath a canvas cover. Riding with me was Cal Vickers, a 58-year-old grader operator who had lived in the county all his life. Cal knew every active road in that part of Idaho, and most of the dead ones. He had the kind of face that always looked sunburned, even in winter, and he spoke so little that when he did say something, people usually listened. We should have left before noon. A cracked fuel line delayed us. Then the replacement fitting turned out to be the wrong size. By the time we finally rolled out of the equipment yard, it was almost 5 in the afternoon. I asked Cal whether we should wait until morning. He looked at the clouds building over the western ridges. If the storm gets there first, he said, that station could be down another week. So we went. For the first hour, the route was easy. We followed a maintained gravel road through open timber and old clear cuts glowing gold in the late sun. Then we reached a rusted gate that had been chained open and pushed into the brush. Beyond it, the road narrowed immediately. Grass grew between the tire tracks. Young pines leaned over the shoulders. Water had eaten channels across the roadbed deep enough to catch an axle. I kept the truck in low gear and let all 6 wheels crawl. There was no cell service after the gate. The radio gave us only static. We had a paper map, a compass, 2 flashlights, a first aid kit, a chainsaw, and enough diesel to turn around if we had to. At the time, that felt like preparation. The sun disappeared behind the ridge before 8. Darkness came quickly beneath the trees. Cal had been quiet for most of the drive. Then, as we passed the remains of an old loading platform, he leaned toward the windshield. "This is where the camp started," he said. I asked what camps he meant. Road crews, timber crews. There used to be 3 settlements through here. Not towns exactly. Bunkhouses, cook shacks, equipment sheds. A few families. I could see only collapsed roofs beneath the brush. 1 stone chimney stood by itself among the pines. What happened to them? The company pulled out. That all? Cal watched the chimney until it disappeared behind us. No, he said. That wasn't all. I laughed because I assumed he was setting up some local ghost story. Cal did not laugh with me. The road climbed into older forest. The trees were enormous there, mostly cedar, fir, and white pine. Their trunks rose beyond the headlights and disappeared into darkness. The air smelled of dust, warm bark, and the faint electrical scent that comes before a storm. Cal said Alder Fork had been cut in the late 1930s by a federal work crew. They were trying to connect the timber camps to a rail spur in the next valley. The work went well until they reached a low saddle between 2 ridges. There was a cedar in the middle of the planned route, he said. Too big to go around. They brought in a dozer and pushed it over. Under the roots, the crew found something made of black stone. According to Cal, it was roughly the size of a person, but shaped wrong. The upper half looked human. It had shoulders, arms, a chest, and a narrow head. Below the ribs, the figure became a thick curve like the body of a snake. It had been buried upright beneath the cedar, facing east. I asked who had carved it. Nobody knew. Native. Some people said that. Other people said it didn't look like anything from around here. I glanced at him. And you believe this? I believe they found something. He told me that a professor from a university came with 2 assistants. They photographed the object and planned to transport it the following morning, but during the night, it disappeared. Stolen? I asked. That was the official story. What was the unofficial story? Cal looked through his window at the trees. The crew said there were drag marks leading away from the roots and into the timber. No truck tracks, no footprints. I told him that sounded exactly like the kind of story men invented after stealing an artifact they hoped to sell. Probably, he said, but he continued. After the stone vanished, things began going wrong at the camps. Men who had worked together for years started fighting. Equipment failed in ways the mechanics could not explain. One worker walked away from breakfast and was found 3 days later standing waist-deep in a creek. He could not remember how he had gotten there. Horses broke their tie lines and ran into the forest. At night, people heard something heavy moving along the cut bank above the bunkhouses. Then came the clouds. Cal said perfectly black clouds sometimes formed above the saddle on otherwise clear afternoons. They did not move with the wind. They remained in one place for 20 or 30 minutes, and then disappeared without producing rain. You heard all this from your grandfather? I asked. My father. He worked salvage up here in the 60s. Did he ever see anything? Cal waited so long that I thought he would not answer. He saw the road after something crossed it. What does that mean? He never explained. The truck dropped into a rut, hard enough to throw us against our seatbelts. Chains rattled on the flatbed. I focused on the road and allowed the conversation to end. For the next 40 minutes, neither of us spoke. Full darkness settled around the truck. The headlights formed a narrow tunnel through the forest. Dust floated in the beams. Every so often, a branch scraped the side mirror with a sound like fingernails dragged across metal. The storm was still miles away, but silent flashes appeared behind the ridges. Each one turned the gaps between the trees pale violet for a fraction of a second. Around 10:30, the road leveled out. Cal unfolded the map across his knees and studied it with his flashlight. We should be near the saddle, he said. The phrase brought back his story about the buried figure, but I did not mention it. The forest changed there. The trees stood farther apart, and almost nothing grew beneath them. No brush, no ferns, no grass, only a floor of needles and exposed stone. Even with the windows closed, I noticed the temperature dropping. The truck's dashboard thermometer fell from 61 degrees to 54 in less than 10 minutes. I blamed the elevation. Then the radio crackled. A voice came through so faintly that I could not tell whether it belonged to a man or a woman. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, followed by a burst of static. I reached for the handset. County relay, this is Northridge Maintenance. Do you copy? Nothing answered. Cal turned down the heater fan and listened. I tried again. Only static. That station is still dead, I said. We probably picked up another crew. Cal stared through the windshield. Not on this frequency. We continued. A mile later, we passed a side road marked by 2 rotting wooden posts. Something pale hung between them. I slowed, thinking it might be a sign, but it was only an old chain with several strips of faded cloth tied around it. Cal said, Don't turn there. I wasn't planning to. Good. The road curved around a rock face and began descending. The surface improved enough for me to shift up 1 gear. I remember feeling relieved. According to the map, we had crossed the worst section. The relay station was less than 12 miles away. Then Cal grabbed the dashboard. Stop! I hit the brakes. The truck shuddered. The generator chains snapped tight, and loose tools slid beneath our seats. At first, I saw nothing except the road. Then the shape resolved in the headlights. Something lay across both tire tracks about 50 feet ahead. It was thick, dark, and long enough to reach from the uphill ditch to the trees on the opposite side. The middle was as wide as an oil drum. Its surface looked burned or wet. Because it had no branches, I assumed it was a section of old utility pole or a stripped tree trunk that had rolled down from the slope. Cal whispered, Back up. I kept my foot on the brake. It's a log. No. We have a chainsaw. Back up. There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Cal was not a nervous man. I had once watched him stand beside a burning loader while a fuel tank vented less than 10 feet away. Now his right hand was shaking against the dashboard. I shifted into reverse. Before I could release the brake, the thing moved. It did not roll. It did not slide sideways. The long black shape contracted from both sides of the road, the way a snake gathers its body before moving. A section that I had taken for a broken stump lifted from the uphill ditch. It was an arm, a human arm. It planted a hand on the road. The fingers were too long. Each one was black and narrow, with no reflection from fingernails or skin. The hand pressed down, and the front part of the body rose. What emerged above the massive serpent-like length had the proportions of a man from the waist up. It had shoulders, a chest, 2 arms, and a head. But its body was completely black, not dark-skinned, not covered in fur, not dressed in black clothing. It was black in the way charcoal becomes black after rain. The torso was too long. Its shoulders were narrow, but the arms reached almost to the ground, where a human body should have ended at the hips. It joined directly into the enormous serpentine mass stretched across the road. Still 50 feet away, it raised its upper body several feet above the road. Cal made a small sound beside me. A sharp breath pulled through his teeth. The creature turned toward us. Its head was human in outline, but I could not see a face. There were shallow places where eyes should have been, and a vertical line that might have been a mouth. The headlights struck it directly, yet its surface seemed to absorb the light. It placed its second hand on the road. The lower half did not coil beneath it. Most of the body remained extended across the road, with both ends disappearing into the forest. Then it began moving toward us. It pulled itself forward with its arms while slow contractions traveled through the long body behind it. The movement was deliberate and steady. 50 feet became 40, then 30. I should have released the brake and backed away. Instead, I sat frozen with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gearshift. The creature continued advancing. Its hands reached forward one after the other, pressing against the road and dragging the upper body closer, while the immense lower half followed in a broad curve. At 15 feet, its shoulders rose above the hood. At 10, I could see that the surface of its chest was not smooth. Faint ridges ran beneath the blackness, as if the shape of ribs had been pressed outward from inside. It stopped directly in front of the truck. I remember every detail of the cab at that moment: the green glow of the gauges, dust along the windshield seal, a cracked plastic coffee cup in the holder, Cal's folded map on the floor. My mind fixed on ordinary objects, because the thing outside did not fit anywhere in it. The creature leaned forward, its head tilted slightly, as though it could see us despite having no visible eyes. Then it lifted one hand from the road and pressed it against the front of the truck. The palm landed on the grill with a dull metallic knock. The truck rocked beneath us. 5 fingers curled around the edge of the hood. Cal shouted, "Go!" I was already moving. I slammed the transmission into reverse and hit the accelerator. The engine roared. All 6 tires spun, throwing dirt and loose stones behind us. For half a second, the truck did not move. The creature's arms straightened. I had the impossible impression that it was holding the truck in place. Then the tires caught. The truck lurched backward. The black hand slid across the hood and disappeared. I kept the wheel straight and backed down the road as quickly as I dared. The creature did not chase us. It remained in the headlights with its upper body raised near the center of the road. Its massive lower half was still stretched across the grade and into the trees on both sides. At about 100 yards, the bend concealed it from view. I stopped. Cal shouted at me not to. "We can't reverse 12 miles, I said. Then turn around. There's nowhere to turn. Make somewhere." The road was barely wider than the truck. On one side stood a rock wall. On the other, the ground dropped through the trees into darkness. The last place wide enough to turn had been several miles behind us. I locked the brakes and listened. The engine idled loudly. Beyond it, I heard nothing. No movement in the brush, no rocks shifting, no insects. Cal reached for the door handle. I caught his sleeve. "What are you doing?" "Checking the drop." "You're not getting out. We have to turn around. We'll back up to that side road." He looked toward the darkness behind us. "That road goes into the old camp. Then we'll back past it." Cal pulled his hand away from the door. "What?" I asked. "You didn't see how long it was." "I saw enough." No. Part of the body was already deep in those trees before the upper half even rose from the ditch. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I finally asked, "Was that what your father had been talking about?" Cal swallowed. "I don't know. You said he saw the road after something crossed it. He found marks, wide ones, like something had dragged a steel cable through wet gravel. And handprints on a grater blade." The engine temperature warning light flickered. I looked down. The needle was climbing. That made no sense. We had been moving slowly, but not enough to overheat the engine. I switched it off. The sudden silence felt enormous. A faint ticking came from beneath the hood. Then something moved among the trees uphill. One branch bent. Another shook farther back. The movement traveled parallel to the road. Cal whispered, "Start it." I turned the key. The starter clicked once. Nothing else happened. I tried again. Click. The truck's batteries had been strong all day. The alternator gauge had shown a normal charge. From the forest came a low, dragging sound. Not footsteps, not leaves moving in the wind. Something heavy sliding over pine needles and dead branches. I pumped the accelerator, even though I knew it would not help, and turned the key a third time. The starter caught. The engine rolled twice and died. The dragging stopped. Cal picked up the long flashlight, but he did not switch it on. He held it across his chest like a club. A shape passed between two trees above the road. I saw only the upper half. A black shoulder, a narrow, human-like head, one long arm reaching from trunk to trunk. A branch bowed beneath its weight and slowly rose again after it passed. Then the dragging sound returned several yards farther along the slope. The creature had crossed the distance from the bend without following the road. I turned the key again. This time the engine started. I did not wait for the gauges. I released the brake, shifted into reverse, and drove backward with the side mirrors brushing branches on both sides. The truck's headlights pointed away from our direction of travel, so I could see only darkness in the mirrors and a narrow strip of road behind us in the red glow of the taillights. Cal twisted around in his seat, watching through the windshield for the creature. "Do you see it?" I asked. "No." "Tell me if it comes onto the road." "It isn't on the road." The way he said it made my hands tighten around the wheel. For nearly a mile, we backed without seeing it again. The engine temperature returned to normal. The radio remained silent. Then Cal said, "There." A black figure stood among the trees on the inside of the curve. It was ahead of the truck now, on my side, perhaps 30 feet from the road. The upper body was upright. The serpent-like lower half disappeared behind several trunks. As we reversed past it, the head turned and followed the cab. It did not attack us. It did not move closer. It simply watched us leave. We reached the side road, marked by the hanging strips of cloth. The entrance was barely wide enough to push the rear of the truck into it and turn by making a series of short, dangerous adjustments. The ground was soft, and twice the rear tires slipped toward the ditch. Cal guided me from inside the cab because neither of us was willing to step outside. When the truck finally faced the way we had come, I stopped long enough to look back up Alder Fork Road. The darkness between the trees was complete. I switched on every forward light the truck had. High beams, work lamps, the yellow roof lights. The forest appeared in hard pieces, trunks, stones, branches, and patches of bare ground. There was no creature. We drove. I did not slow for the ruts, unless I believed they could break an axle. The generator shifted against its chains. Branches struck the windshield. Once, the rear wheels slid sideways, and the truck nearly dropped into a washout. I corrected without stopping. Cal kept watching the forest. About 20 minutes later, the radio came alive. A dispatcher's voice broke through the static, asking whether any unit could hear her. I grabbed the handset. "This is Northridge Maintenance. We're on Alder Fork, returning to the south gate." There was a pause. "Alder Fork?" "That's correct." Another pause. "What is your status?" I looked at Cal. He shook his head. "Mechanical issue," I said. "We're turning back." The dispatcher told us the storm had shifted and that the relay repair could wait until morning. Her voice sounded ordinary and calm. Hearing another person nearly made me lose control of the truck. We reached the gate shortly after 1:30 in the morning. I stopped on the maintained road, where the forest opened enough for moonlight to reach the roadside. Neither of us moved for a while. Finally, Cal opened his door and got out. I followed him. The air was warm again. Insects buzzed in the grass. Far away, thunder rolled over the mountains. We walked to the front of the truck. 5 shallow dents marked the grille. The hood had been pulled forward almost half an inch on one hinge. Across the dust lay a black smear shaped like a hand. Cal found a dry twig on the shoulder of the road. He pressed the end of it into the smear and lifted it carefully. The substance clung to the bark and stretched into a thin black strand. It sagged beneath its own weight, but did not immediately break. It looked like soot, mixed with oil, and smelled faintly of stagnant water. Cal lowered the twig and dropped it beside the road. We did not return to the equipment yard that night. We drove to a 24-hour truck stop beside the highway and sat beneath fluorescent lights until sunrise. Cal drank coffee. I did not drink anything. Every time a vehicle crossed the parking lot, I looked toward the windows. At 7, we called the dispatcher and said the truck had overheated. It was partly true. The company sent another crew to deliver the generator after a temporary bridge was installed on the main road. No one asked us to use Alder Fork again. I might eventually have convinced myself that exhaustion and darkness had distorted what we saw if not for the damage to the truck. The shop manager blamed a loose chain or a fallen branch. When I showed him the hand-shaped smear, he cleaned it away with solvent and told me not to be dramatic. Cal did not argue. 3 days later, he came to my house carrying a manila envelope. Inside was a photocopy from a county historical collection. The original photograph had been taken in 1938. It showed 9 road workers standing beside the roots of a fallen cedar. Between them was a dark stone figure. The photograph was grainy, but its shape was unmistakable. A narrow human torso, long arms, a head with almost no features, and below the ribs, a thick body curving into the dirt. Someone had typed a caption beneath the photograph: "Object uncovered during Alder Fork Road construction. Removed before cataloging." I asked Cal where he had found it. "My father kept a copy." "Why didn't you show me before we went?" "Because I hadn't looked at it in years, and because I thought it was just a story." I stared at the photograph. "What do you think now?" Cal looked toward the trees behind my house. "I think that road should have stayed closed." We never reported what happened officially. What could we have said? That a half-human, half-serpent creature had stopped a work truck on an abandoned logging road? The company would have assumed we had been drinking. The county might have sent someone to inspect the area, but Cal refused to give them a reason. A month later, he retired. I remained with the contractor for another 2 years. I continued driving remote roads during daylight, but I never again accepted a night assignment beyond radio range. When the dispatchers joked about it, I told them my night vision was getting bad. That was the last time I traveled Alder Fork Road. People say we build roads into the wilderness to make the unknown familiar. We give a place a name, mark it on a map, and begin to believe that it belongs to us. I do not believe that anymore. Whenever I remember Alder Fork, I do not think the creature crossed our road. I think our road had been laid across a path that belonged to it long before any of us arrived. That was the second story in the 5th collection. Stay tuned to Mystic Wilds, to be continued.
The forest called us by name. Location: Blackwater Hollow, West Virginia. Approximate year: 1998. I am 61 years old now. For most of my adult life, I worked around things people would rather not remember. Car wrecks, domestic calls, bodies pulled from creeks, families waiting for someone who never came home. I spent 27 years in county law enforcement, and during that time, I learned that almost every frightening thing becomes less frightening once you understand what caused it. A sound in an empty house becomes loose plumbing. A light moving through the trees becomes a hunter. A missing person becomes a set of tracks, an accident, or a body in a place nobody thought to search. Almost everything leaves an explanation behind. What happened in Blackwater Hollow did not. It was October of 1998. I was 33 and working as a deputy in southern West Virginia. The coal mine outside Blackwater had closed 6 years earlier. Half the houses along the creek were empty, and weeds grew through the gravel where the old railroad branch had once carried coal out of the mountains. Beyond the last homes, the abandoned rail grade continued into the forest for almost 9 miles. The tracks were gone, but the raised bed remained, cutting through steep country where daylight disappeared early beneath hemlocks and poplars. The first call came shortly after 6 on a Thursday morning. A woman named June Hale reported that her older brother Curtis had vanished during the night. Curtis was 42. He had worked at the mine until it closed, then took whatever jobs he could find. Curtis and I had gone to school together. We were never close, but he had called me Danny since we were boys. He drank more than he should have, but he was not known for wandering off. His truck was still beside the house. His wallet and keys were inside. The back door stood open. June waited on the porch, wearing a man's coat over her nightgown. Before my partner, Mark Ellison, and I reached the steps, she said, "He went into the woods." I asked how she knew. She pointed behind the property. Beyond a patch of dead grass and a rusted fence, the forest rose toward the old railroad grade. Curtis's dog was tied near the shed. It normally barked at everyone. That morning, it lay flat against the ground, staring between the trees. June told us Curtis had been acting strangely for several days. He kept saying Eli was calling him, she said. Mark and I both knew the name. Eli Hale was Curtis's younger brother. He had disappeared in those mountains in 1987 while checking hunting traps before a snowstorm. Search crews found one glove near the abandoned rail bed. Nothing else. "Did you hear the voice?" I asked. June shook her head. "Was Curtis drinking?" "A little." That usually meant a lot. We searched the house. There was no sign of violence. Curtis's bed had not been used. His heavy jacket and one pair of boots were missing. Behind the fence, we found a single set of tracks leading uphill. None came back. By 8 o'clock, the volunteer fire department had joined us. The sheriff sent a tracking dog and handler. 2 forestry workers came because they knew the old grade. The weather made the search urgent. A cold front was expected after dark, with heavy rain and temperatures close to freezing. The dog took Curtis's scent from a shirt and led us toward the forest. For the first half-mile, the trail was clear. Curtis had crossed a utility cut, reached the abandoned rail bed, and turned east into the hollow. Near an old concrete drainage tunnel, the dog stopped. The tunnel passed beneath the grade and opened into a steep ravine. It was partly blocked by mud and branches. The dog lowered itself and began whining. Its handler, Vernon Cole, tried to lead it forward. The animal pulled backward so hard the collar nearly came over its head. We found no bear tracks, carcass, or anything else that explained the reaction. Vernon walked the dog around the tunnel. It recovered Curtis's scent on the far side, but from then on it kept looking behind us. Around 11, Mark and I moved ahead of the others. The grade curved along the mountain. We had stopped beside a broken branch when someone called my name. "Dan?" The voice came from uphill. I turned toward the slope. "Curtis?" After a pause, the voice answered, "Over here." Mark heard it too. We climbed through mountain laurel toward the sound. The slope was steep and covered with loose stone. We called Curtis's name every few yards, but he did not answer again. At the top, we reached a narrow shelf beneath sandstone cliffs. Nobody was there. No tracks, no broken brush, no place for a man to hide without being seen. Mark looked back toward the valley. Sound must have carried. That was possible. Voices travel strangely in steep country. Still, the voice had not shouted for help. It had called me by name. Shortly after noon, one of the forestry workers found a cigarette butt near a fallen oak. The paper was still dry beneath the damp leaves, and Curtis smoked the same brand. Nearby was a boot print matching those behind his house. The trail left the railroad grade and followed an old logging path south. We divided into smaller groups. Mark, Vernon, the dog, and I took the logging trail. The farther we went, the quieter the forest became. There was almost no wind, but we kept hearing branches shifting above us. Each time we stopped, the sound stopped too. The dog began turning around every few yards. Vernon said, "Ranger thinks somebody is following us." Mark forced a laugh. "Maybe Curtis is." Nobody answered. At 2 in the afternoon, we reached the remains of an old railroad work camp. Only concrete footings, rusted cable, and a collapsed shed remained. Curtis's trail passed directly through it. We found another cigarette butt beside a concrete block. In the dirt, someone had scratched one word with a stick, ELI. The letters were large and uneven. The dog followed the scent 20 yards beyond the camp. Then it stopped. Not weakened, not confused. Stopped. Ranger circled with his nose against the leaves, but could not recover the trail. It was as though Curtis had reached that point and disappeared. We searched until late afternoon and found nothing else. At the command post, more volunteers had arrived. The rescue squad had set up lights beside the road. The sheriff wanted to suspend the deeper search after dark, but the temperature was falling faster than predicted. If Curtis was injured, waiting until morning might kill him. We agreed to continue along marked trails until midnight. That was when I first spoke with Emmett Rusk. Emmett was 68 and had spent most of his life underground. He had served on the mine rescue team and still volunteered whenever someone went missing. He asked where we had lost the trail. "The old work camp near Briar Fork," I said. His expression changed. "Did you hear anything out there?" I told him about the voice on the hillside. Emmett looked toward the mountains. "Did you see who called you?" "No." "Then you didn't hear a person." Mark smiled, but Emmett did not. He said people around Blackwater had stories about voices in the mountains. Miners heard their names from sealed tunnels. Hunters heard relatives calling from the wrong side of a ridge. Parents heard children crying beyond the tree line while those children were safe at home. I asked whether he believed those stories. He answered with another question. "You remember the search for Eli Hale?" "Of course I did." 2 men heard Eli calling from opposite sides of the same hollow, Emmett said. His father heard both voices. One was asking for help, the other was laughing. Before I could ask more, the sheriff called us over. A search team had found a strip of orange fabric almost 2 miles south of the rail grade. June confirmed that Curtis's jacket had orange lining. We organized one final search of the southern trail. Our group consisted of Mark, a firefighter named Aaron Boyd, and me. Vernon tried to bring Ranger, but the dog crawled beneath his truck and growled whenever anyone pulled the leash toward the forest. We went without him. Karen Pike, captain of the rescue squad, remained at the command post with Emmett. They had the trauma bag, folding litter, spare lights, and the strongest radio. We entered the forest shortly after 7. Mist gathered among the trees, turning our flashlight beams white. We reached the old camp, then followed reflective tape toward the place where the fabric had been found. A few minutes later, we found Curtis's jacket hanging from the fork of a young tree. The zipper was open. One side of the lining had been torn. There was no blood. Below it, boot prints continued south. We followed them into a shallow hollow where an old bridge had once crossed a creek. Curtis's prints led beneath one of the stone supports. There they crossed and doubled back as though he had walked in circles. Then they vanished among the rocks. We spread out, but remained within sight of one another. "Curtis!" Mark shouted. His voice faded through the hollow. A moment later, someone answered downstream. "Help me!" The voice was weak but clear. Mark immediately moved toward it. Aaron and I followed. "Keep talking," I called. "Help me." We pushed through brush along the creek. "I broke my leg," the voice said. Then the same sentence came from behind us. "I broke my leg." We stopped. It was not a similar voice. It was identical. The same strained breath, the same pause, the same crack on the final word. Mark turned slowly. That came from the bridge. The voice downstream repeated, "I broke my leg." Then the voice behind us repeated it again. Aaron raised his flashlight toward the trees. "What the hell is this?" I called the command post on the radio. Only static answered. Then the voice ahead changed. "Dan?" It sounded like Curtis, not a stranger. "Curtis!" "Dan, come down here." Mark whispered, "Don't answer it." A branch cracked uphill. All 3 of us turned our lights toward it. Nothing moved. Then Karen Pike's voice called from somewhere across the creek. "Dan, bring the litter." That was impossible. Karen was nearly 2 miles away. Her voice came again, perfect, down to the rasp from years of smoking. "We found him." I tried the radio once more. "Command, this is Mercer. Respond." Through the static, the real Karen answered. "Mercer, return to command. Storm moving in. All teams return." At the same moment, Karen's voice in the woods said, "Dan, don't listen to that." For several seconds, none of us moved. Then I said, "We're leaving." We stayed together and retraced our route. The voices followed. Curtis called for help from behind us. Karen ordered us to stop from the slope above. Once, Aaron's voice came from somewhere ahead, even though Aaron was walking beside me. "Mark went the wrong way," it said. None of us answered. After that, the voices became quieter. They did not sound angry. They sounded patient. About half a mile from the command post, my radio was still giving us nothing but static. We kept moving through the southern woods, following our own reflective markers back toward the road. While we were making our way back, Karen and Emmett heard my voice from the trees north of the road. Karen told me the sequence later, and Emmett confirmed every detail. "We found him!" the voice shouted. "Bring the litter and the lights." Karen immediately grabbed the trauma bag. Emmett took the folded litter and a battery lantern. They crossed the road and reached the northern tree line. My voice called again. "Quickly! He's still alive!" Karen stepped between the first trees while Emmett followed with the litter. The voice moved farther into the darkness. "Straight ahead!" At that exact moment, the command radio crackled behind them. My real voice came through the speaker. "Command, this is Mercer. We're approaching from the south, 2 minutes out." Karen stopped. My voice came again from directly ahead of her. "Don't listen to that. Come here." She began backing toward the road. Then footsteps approached from the southern trail. Karen turned. Mark, Aaron, and I emerged from the trees and crossed the road toward the vehicles. Our clothes were wet. Mark carried Curtis's jacket. I held the radio in my hand. Karen stared at me. I asked why she was standing at the tree line with the trauma bag. Before she could answer, my voice came from the darkness behind her. "Don't stand there." Everyone froze. The voice was mine, not close to mine. Mine. It had my accent, my rhythm, even the roughness in my throat after hours of shouting. "Come here," it said. Karen began backing toward the road. The voice continued. "Only the two of you." Emmett dropped one end of the litter. It struck a rock with a metallic crack. For a moment, the forest was silent. Then the thing spoke in Curtis Hale's voice. "Danny." Only a few people still called me that. Curtis was one of them. "Don't leave me out here." Mark reached Karen and pulled her onto the road. We turned the vehicles so their headlights faced the forest. The beams illuminated wet trunks, low branches, and drifting mist. Nothing stood there, no person, no animal. Then my voice came from farther uphill. "Karen?" A few seconds later, Curtis's voice came from the opposite side of the road. "Emmett." The two voices alternated, mine from the north, Curtis's from the south. Neither shouted. They spoke as though standing only yards away. We stayed beside the vehicles with the engines running and did not answer. After several minutes, the words stopped. Something began moving through the woods around us. Branches bent, leaves shifted. The sound passed behind the vehicles and emerged on the other side. It seemed too heavy to be a person and too deliberate to be an animal. It never entered the light. When the sheriff and the other search teams returned to the command post, the movement stopped. The night search was suspended. At sunrise, we searched the northern tree line. There were no tracks except those left by Karen and Emmett. No footprints leading away from the place where the voice had called them. No sign that another person had been there. 2 search dogs refused to work near the road. For 3 more days, we searched Briar Fork and the abandoned railroad grade. We found Curtis's jacket, the cigarette butts, and the word ELI scratched into the dirt. Nothing else. Curtis Hale was never found. The official report said he entered the forest while intoxicated and probably suffered an accident in difficult terrain. That remains possible. Those mountains contain cliffs, abandoned mine openings, and ravines deep enough to hide a body for decades. But it does not explain the voices. It does not explain how something north of the road used my voice while I was returning from the south. And it does not explain why it asked Karen and Emmett to come alone. Several weeks later, I visited Emmett at his house. I asked why he had hesitated before entering the woods. He sat quietly for a long time, then said, "The woods never ask you to come out. They always ask you to come farther in." During the search for Eli in 1987, Emmett had heard his dead wife calling from a ravine. He had not followed. Another volunteer heard his daughter crying and did. That man was found the next morning nearly 4 miles away, barefoot and unable to explain how he had crossed the mountain. His daughter lived in Ohio. Emmett told me the old miners followed one rule. If someone called from darkness, you made them step into the light before you moved toward them. You did not trust a voice. You trusted a face. I never included that conversation in my report. At 33, I cared too much about how it would sound. At 61, I care less. Karen left the rescue squad the following spring. Mark transferred to another county. Aaron stopped volunteering for wilderness searches. Emmett died in 2004. Curtis and Eli Hale are still listed as missing. The old railroad grade is almost completely overgrown now. Floods washed out the access road, and the county eventually placed gates across the entrance. I moved away from Blackwater years ago. I live in a neighborhood with streetlights and houses on both sides. Even so, I never answer someone calling from a place I cannot see. Sometimes my grandchildren hide near the fence and shout for me to find them. I always make them step into view first. They think it is part of the game. I let them think that, because what I remember most clearly from that night is not Curtis's empty jacket. It is not Karen standing at the tree line. It is not the movement circling beyond the headlights. It is the calmness of my own voice coming from those woods. It did not sound angry. It did not sound hungry. It sounded helpful. It sounded exactly like a man trying to save someone's life. And that is why I believe Curtis followed it. Whatever lived in Blackwater Hollow did not chase people. It did not need to. It waited until it found the right voice. Then it called them by name. That was the third story from the 5th collection. Stay tuned to Mystic Wild to be continued.